You hear me? Does microphone work? Yes, microphone, cool. Now you shut up, okay? So hello, I'm Hannes. I'm gonna talk to you today about mostly woodworking and guitar building. There's a little bit of coder references in this talk, but I mostly use the title to get accepted so I can talk about my hobby. It's a cheat. If you're not here for that, feel free to walk out. I won't be offended. If you're the last person here, I mean, we better head to the pub. But okay, so I'm gonna talk about building guitars and not too much about building code. But there are many references between the two. There's many similarities. So what's going to happen, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why I got started building guitars, because I build guitars for a hobby and a side business. Then I'm going to talk to you about craftsmanship and how that applies in both coding and building guitars. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit of the technical bits that go into building custom guitars. What's the kind of stuff you need to get good at to build actually playable instruments. And then I'm going to debunk a couple of myths, and then I would like to explore the concept of irreversibility. Right? And after that, we're going to head out of here, and I'm actually going to rush. I'm not going to take any questions. I'm going to pack up my stuff, because right after this, I have to go set up to play music with Dylan and the Line Breakers. And yeah, they gave me last slot of the day because it makes it more exciting, right? So here we go.
You don't need to know. I'm already here as a guitarist. You don't need to spare, man.
I know, but we can do this. So why did a software developer start building guitars? And for that, I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story. And I vowed after this period that I would tell this story more often and be more open about it, so here it goes. This is the house where I was living in 2012. It's an old house, was built in 1939. I had just had my first kid, I had just switched jobs, I had just made coach at Access, and because we were renovating this house, because it didn't stay like this for very long, we were living with my mother and father-in-law, something that I highly recommend against, okay? But we were renovating this house while we were living with my in-laws, with my infant child and all of that. And you can already imagine with all of this going on that I wasn't properly taking care of myself. So I neglected myself, but I was doing all these things. And at some point, like, I burned out. And when I say burned out, it's like there was a day that I woke up and I had to go into work and just couldn't. It's like, I don't want to get out of bed. So I called my HR manager and told him, Tom, I don't know what's going on, but I'm not coming in today. It's not going to work. So I went to a doctor. And my doctor told me at that time, it's like, yeah, you're a bit overstressed. Maybe stay home for a week or two. And I was like, a week or two? Can I afford to do a week or two? But at least, like, if she had told me at that time, you're going to be home for 5 months, I would have gone straight back to work, right? So she told me the right thing. She told me, like, you stay home 2 weeks, then you're going to go back. It took a lot of work. Like, I'm never going to go through that again. Nothing is worth doing that again. And actually, I took my own advice because I recently rearranged my entire job situation because I was feeling stressed again. And I'm going to make sure that this doesn't happen again. But it took a lot. I started seeing a psychologist. I took antidepressants. I had to make sure that the renovation got finished so we could move back into our own house and away from the in-laws. I started exercising a lot because that helped. It's also something I started doing the last year again because I was feeling stressed. And a lot of it was like making time for myself again, because it's very easy to lose yourself if you're juggling a family with a job and responsibilities and renovations, and you don't make time. And with my psychologist, I was exploring the idea of a hobby, because I didn't have a hobby anymore. But I'm also the kind of person who, like, just sitting in front of the TV, watching shows, or maybe picking up padel, which seems to be the very popular thing in Belgium at the moment. Is it popular here? Yeah? Yeah? Okay. It's not really my kind of thing. I need... Padel?
Paddle.
You call it paddle? It's a Spanish sport. It's pronounced padel, okay? Right. So what we explored is, Hannes, the kind of hobby that you need a couple of things. You need a challenge. And that's very true. I need a challenge with everything that I do. And you like learning, so if that can be a part of your hobby, you won't get bored of it really quickly. I also enjoy community aspects. Well, I'm standing on a stage talking to you, right? Community is very important. And I like everything that's very skillful. So it's like, yeah, where am I gonna find that? And I always played guitar. Like as a teenager, I played guitar well into my 20s. I've always had guitars around. There's always one in my office that is ready to be picked up. It's like, how about I build guitars? That sounds like it has all of these things in it. It's like, okay, that sounds like an excellent hobby. Except I didn't know anything, right? I wasn't even a woodworker at the time. So I got started. And this is the result of me building my first guitar. That's the first guitar I ever made. But to get there, from the point where I decided with my psychologist, like, I'm gonna do this, I first needed to learn woodworking. So I went to woodworking class, like evening school. I'm actually a licensed carpenter now, like side degree. I read a lot of guitar repair and maintenance books, and there is a treasure of info on YouTube. There's a couple of great guitar builders who stream a lot of their stuff. I learned so much there. And after a few years of doing evening school, I felt ready to start on that first guitar. And that meant that, like, for the first one, I ordered the templates. I didn't make them myself. I got some wood. I chose a pretty simple guitar design. The part that is complex about this guitar is the electronics, but I had soldered together so many pedals before that the electronics didn't intimidate me. So I was like, this is the perfect model. I'm going to go for that one. And it took me about half a year to build this. Because before I started, it looked like this. That's the wood after I joined it together, after I rough cut it, that would turn into that green thing. The other one turned into a natural wood one that is still in my house as well. So that's how that guitar started. Because most of the people build a body and buy a neck for their first guitar because that makes it a lot easier. It gets you acquainted to just finishing the wood and then assembling the guitar and putting the electronics in. Well, as we already established, that wasn't going to be me. I was going to do something that was harder. So I needed to start from scratch. And when I mean from scratch, I mean really from scratch. Because I wanted to do as many of the parts as I could so that I could learn the maximum amount from that first guitar to make sure that I got better at building them. And this is where I see a lot of similarities between this kind of crafty hobbies and writing code. And when you look around the dev community, you will see that people are into woodworking or they're into any other crafty hobbies because a lot of the things are very similar between writing code. If we look at the things that we need to do our job, well, you need to first gather a whole bunch of knowledge. You need to learn about frameworks and libraries, and you have to figure out what your architecture is gonna look like, infrastructure, clean code, solid, a whole bunch of things that you need to learn about to be able to do your job. And it's very, very similar with woodworking because you need to learn about what kind of wood species there are and how you can use them because they all have different strengths and weaknesses. There are wood species that are very hard to use in flooring, for instance, but as soon as they get wet, they break down. Like beech, for instance, is very hard, but it's not durable. If it gets wet a couple of times, it basically starts rotting away. Whereas oak is less hard than beech, but it can resist water way better. Now, water in guitars, not really important. But you need to learn about what kind of species of wood there are. There are many different types of glues that all have their advantages and disadvantages. And one of the common sayings is if you use normal PVA wood glue, that the glue joint is going to be stronger than the wood itself, which is completely true if you make a good glue joint. But it isn't the easiest one to take apart. So sometimes we use hide glue for certain things, and there are different types of glues that you would use for different purposes. And then, of course, you need to learn about all the tools. Just like we learn in coding about the tools that we use, we need to learn how to use the tools in woodworking. That's why I went to evening school. So, and then there is once you learn about the what, you're going to have to learn about the how. You need to know how to apply all these things. So we start practicing as developers. We do things like test-driven development. We have frameworks around how we deal with things as a team, pair programming, mob programming. We will use Agile. You have to learn how to refactor your code. I had to mention that because Kevin is in the room here. But things like event storming, figuring out what you're going to do and how things piece together, we learn so many techniques to be able to do our job. And it's very similar to these crafty hobbies. So in woodworking, you have things like joinery, how you combine two pieces of wood together to make a strong joint. Because that's going to be an important part if you want to make anything that's bigger than a single piece of wood. But also how you make templates to then use those templates to transfer certain designs into the wood consistently. We often could cut out a piece of wood to a certain shape so that we can use a router with a bushing to actually reproduce that shape consistently into a workpiece. But you first have to learn how to make those templates in order to use them. And then how you finish wood to certain degrees. It's still something I struggle with. I'm still not really good at finishing. And then, of course, if you build cabinets, you need to learn about what kind of hinges there are and knobs and all that sort of stuff. And these wood joints, in a crossover between programming and woodworking, were AI generated. So somebody made an AI model to figure out how to make strong wood joints, and they generated a whole bunch. And then, of course, because we have CNC machines, somebody CNC'd them out so you can see what came out. And very interesting shapes. You probably wouldn't come up with them by yourself. Now, I can already guarantee you, if you start out woodworking, your first joints are not really going to look like that. You need to practice quite a lot. And it's something we also do in development. We do coding katas. We take part in hackathons. You practice on your day job. Like, who has tried stuff on their day job for the first time? Yeah, we all have, right? But you have your pet projects and your workshops and all that sort of thing. So you learn a lot by practicing it, and especially when it comes to things like refactoring or practicing clean code or that sort of stuff, it really helps to do it often to get better at it. Now, I practiced a lot of woodworking in evening school. The cool thing about going to evening school was it was very cheap because education is sponsored in Belgium. And I would have access to a very, very well-equipped workshop for 4 hours a week. And the first year you had to do a couple of mandatory exercises, but after that you were expected to apply most of the stuff that you were learning on projects of your own, which was great because I basically had a free workshop for 4 hours a week where I could build whatever I wanted. So I practiced a lot there. And when we practice, we use cheap wood. Why do we use cheap wood? Well, in guitar building, we often use figured woods. And if you have a flame maple top for a guitar, that's a single piece of wood that will set you back 150 euros or something. So if you route into that wrong, then you're basically throwing that away and starting over, right? So make sure that you know what you're doing before you actually cut the wood. There is the saying, measure twice, cut once, and it's there for a reason. And you make so many test pieces. If you want to get that green color out of it, you take a cutoff of the wood that you've just used, you try to color it, see how it comes out, see that it looks the way that you want it to look before you do it on the actual piece. It's very important. So you try everything. You make your templates. You try the templates on a scrap piece of wood. I always have some MDF lying around to try and see if the template does what it needs to do so I can measure the holes afterwards and all that sort of stuff. So you practice and practice and practice, and at some point you say, okay, let's get going. So you make your first wood joint, probably looks like this, right? And if you're a Japanese master carpenter, your joints may look like this. And those are not machine cut. These are carpenters that take pride in the way that they join wood together. And it's a purpose in and of itself. And you would look at this piece of wood, it's like, how is that ever going to fit? It looks like it's impossible, doesn't it? But it slides together in a 45-degree, like all the planes of the joint are in the same direction in a 45-degree angle, and the piece of wood slides together. And they cut this with chisels by hand. fantastic. I mean, it's lovely and it takes lots of patience. I can't do that, by the way. Found the pictures online. But sharpening your skills is definitely a thing that we need to do. And sharpening your skills is the same as sharpening your chisels, because if your skills are up to date, you can do better work. And my chisels and my plane blades, which are just pieces of steel, need to be sharpened to a degree where you can use them accurately. And that means that they will be sharp enough that if I draw them across the back of my hand, I'm actually shaving off the hairs. Right? That's plenty sharp. Why do they need to be that sharp? Because if your tool is really sharp, you won't slip as easily. And you can do cleaner work, but it's also a lot safer because the blade will actually cut the wood. So you have less chance of actually tearing your wood apart because it cuts properly. You have less chance of slipping and cutting yourself. So basically a sharper chisel, although it could easily cut into your skin, will actually lead to less wounds, right? And I still have all my fingers, right? I'm proud of that. Great. It is safer. Now I use a technique called Scary Sharp. And Scary Sharp is a sharpening system invented by a UK woodworker. And it basically employs relatively cheap sandpaper on a piece of float glass. And float glass is glass that is made on a mercury bath. So they have a bath of mercury and they float the glass on top of it, they pour it on top of it, and then it hardens. And it means that it is about as flat as glass can be. The rounding in the glass is the same as the curvature of the earth, right? And that's for woodworking purposes more than flat enough, right? So we glue some sandpaper on top of that and we draw the blades over that and we get to this mirror edge that basically allows us to cut the hairs from the back of our hands, and then we can basically use those blades. This is the cheapest way of doing it. You have people who do this with water stones, with diamond stones, there's so many different techniques out there. This one works for me. It gets my tools sharp enough. And every once in a while, I will spend an evening just sharpening all my stuff. In the beginning, it's not fun. You get better at it. But having sharp tools allows you to do good work. Now, as a developer, we also have tools, right? And those tools need to be up to speed. Now, the thing is, and this is one of my pet peeves, as a software developer, your tools are relatively cheap. Like if you redo your entire desk, let's say you buy a good chair, standing desk, nice desktop PC, nice screen, peripherals, good keyboard, camera, like all that sort of stuff, it's hard to even cross into 10K, right? Like if I allow you tomorrow to spend 10K on your desk, it's gonna be a nice setup. Do we all agree? Yeah, right. Ask a plumber how much money is in the back of their van. Ask a woodworker how much is in their woodworking shop. I have more money worth of tools in my garage than I used to do my day job. And it's true. Because there's so much stuff to buy. And the thing is, we don't need all of it, but it's all available. And all these tools are made for certain purposes to make certain jobs easier. But we do the same thing. We have a certain set of skills, libraries and frameworks we're familiar with, that we can probably use to get most jobs done. There is no need to learn Go. If you're a proficient C# developer, you can probably solve most tasks with C#. There might be use cases where Go is better, but you can still probably get the job done. And it's very much like that with tools. And the Germans made it very clear. Who is familiar with a brand called Festool? Oh, some of you. Okay, good. The woodworking geeks are here, right? This is not something they actually said, but Festool has made it financially impossible to own all the tools to do all the different jobs. For those not familiar with Festool, if you tell a team of German engineers you're going to build the best power tool possible, you're going to make all the accessories for it, and you're going to make it in a way that is both very light, ergonomic, and we're going to have to be able to repair it 15 years down the line because we're going to support these devices very long. Money is like not really a problem. And that's what Festool is. So their tools are probably 3-4 times more expensive than like the brands you would get at a hardware store, but they're such a pleasure to use. The stuff that I use a lot I buy Festool, but it's financially impossible to buy only Festool, right? But the reality is, you will have a couple of tools. The tools that you will actually use, the tools that you have, and you have to know how you can apply them. You can apply them in different ways, you can use tools in different ways, and you can still get that job done, just like you would do with programming. You don't have to have them all, you just know how to apply the ones that you have. And that's also a learning process, because there's a lot of tools that you can use in different ways with different techniques that you don't necessarily see as you first use the intended use for a certain tool. And that's fun, because that's learning for me, and that's the stuff that I like doing. Now when we get to guitars, and you've seen that there's 2 guitars on stage, I'm not going to talk about the red one for now. The red one is one that I didn't build, but it's here for a reason. The other one that does have a Visual Studio logo on it, it is one that I built and that I used to play with Dylan and Line Breakers. I'll talk about that guitar for a bit, and I want to explain a few things about what you need to know when you're building guitars. Now, the first thing is, we have strings, and strings vibrate. Oh, Art wants to take some pictures. You know you've done too many NDCs when you know the photographers' names, right? So strings vibrate at a certain pitch. You get a certain note, right? And it's dictated by 3 factors, and we use all 3 of them on a guitar. It is basically the length of the string, like longer string is a lower note, a shorter string is a higher note. The thickness of the string, because the thicker the string, the lower the note will be. And then there is the tension that we put on it. And on a guitar, we use all 3. We tune the string by changing the tension. On most guitars, there's tuning mechanisms here, because this needed to be treble size. The tuning mechanisms are here. But that allows me to change the tension on the string to tune the string to pitch. We have 6 different strings of different thicknesses, which allows me to play lower notes here and higher notes there, right? And then the length of the string is the thing that we play with when we actually fret notes, because we make the string shorter, right? And we get a higher note. So all 3 of these are in effect. Now, when we build a guitar, we need to make sure that we're able to apply all these factors. Let me get my clicker back. Now, a string probably vibrates in your mind a little bit like this. We have 2 points and it moves up and down. But in reality, when I'm doing this in the wrong order, okay. Okay, I'll first talk about that. I'll first talk about fretboard. The fretboard, which is the thing that if you get from, I'm going to buy a neck and then build the body, and then I'm going to build the body and the neck, but I'm going to buy the fretboard, because that's the hardest part of building your first guitar. The fretboard needs to be dead flat, like front to back, because if the frets go up and down a little bit, when you fret the previous one, the vibrating string will hit the next one. You'll either get the wrong note, or it will get a buzzing sound, which is not nice, right? So it needs to be super flat. But we also make them radiused. So the fretboard, like this, is a little bit rounded. Not because it's necessary, because it's nicer to play. It feels more natural in your hand and you're playing. Now that means that you have to be dead flat in that direction and rounded in the other. And then you need to cut your positions into it to install your frets. So I was going to go one step further. I wasn't going to just make my first fretboard radius blocks, which are just blocks of wood that have that radius of the fretboard into it. You can buy those, but what's the fun in that? So I built this whole contraption to basically route out a perfectly concave piece of wood, to then apply sandpaper to that piece of wood, to use that to sand down the fretboard to the right radius. You see where this is going, right? Overcommitting all the way through. But I made my own blocks. I made my own blocks, and I made them to use them to do my own fretboard. And then you have to cut in the grooves that you will actually hammer the frets into, because the fret at the bottom has a little bit of piece of metal that goes into the wood, and that's what keeps it in place. except on that red guitar, but I'll come back to that later. But on most guitars, it's actually cut into it. And the distances are pretty accurate. If you take the distance from here to there, that is exactly the open note, which means at the halfway point, which is the 12th fret, because in most European music we use 12 semitones in an octave, we get 1 octave up. It's like the same, if you have an E here, you'll have an E there. And all of those ratios, they need to be pretty exact, which means that when you're cutting these slots, if you want to have a guitar that sounds in tune across the neck, you're going to have to account for the thickness of your pencil line when you're cutting these slots with a handsaw. It needs to be that accurate. So you measure all of that out, probably measure twice, cut once. You cut all those fret slots, and that will give you your perfectly playing neck. Now, these strings, when we put them on the neck, they put a lot of tension on the wood. And these are the thicknesses of strings that I usually use on my guitar. So those two, they both have this tension on the neck. And if we add all of that up, we get about 100 pounds of tension. And these are relatively thin strings. If you play thicker strings, it gets worse. But it's 100 pounds of tension that is basically indefinitely pulling along the lines of that neck. That's like the weight of my 10-year-old that's hanging on the strings of a piece of wood that's only like half a baseball bat, right? That's a lot. And it's not perfectly parallel to the neck either, because your strings are a little bit angled up. So it's basically pulling the neck up a tiny bit. And over time, wood will bend. If you apply enough pressure to wood and you have a couple of humidity cycles and so on, your wood will start to form to the pressure that you're applying to it. So your necks naturally will bend up over time. You can see this in old guitars that have been strung up for a long time. The necks actually become completely concave, right? And if you have old guitars that didn't have truss rods, you can only fix that by reheating the wood and bending it back. But most of the modern guitars, what we do is we route a groove in the wood underneath the fretboard, and then we install something called a truss rod. And a truss rod is a device where we have a single bar of metal that sits at the top, and at the bottom we have a bar that has 2 opposed pieces of thread on it, which means if we turn it, the bottom part becomes shorter or longer, right? And that will cause this part to basically bend. If we make this shorter, it will bend back. If we make it longer, it'll bend up. And that gets installed in that groove underneath the fretboard. We glue the fretboard on top of it. That's what it looks like in reality, in a picture, right? So we basically put in a hex key in there, and we can turn that rod, and that will bend that forward and backwards. In this guitar, the hole is sitting like right in there, and in that one, it's just in the top of the headstock, so it's in there. And that allows us to counteract that string tension that we apply to the wood. Now, and this was where I was confused earlier, strings don't vibrate perfectly like this. String vibration is a lot more complex because you play a certain note, but you also get overtones. And the overtones are basically a string that's also vibrating like this a little bit, and also like this, and also like this, and you combine that all into a very complex vibration pattern. That's what a string actually does if you look at it on a slow motion camera. But you can already see if I'm putting my finger down and that is at the point where I'm touching a fret, it's not that pronounced, by the way, but that might hit the next fret and give me fret buzz again. So because this is so complex, if you have a really, really well set up guitar, your neck is actually not flat anymore. Because if your neck is completely flat and we fret down, we cannot lower this point low enough to make it the perfectly playable guitar. It will be good enough, but we can do better. And what we basically do is we allow the strings to pull the neck up a tiny bit. So it's just a slightly bit concave. Slightly bit concave, meaning a couple of thousandths of an inch, right? If you put a straight edge on it, like here at that fret, you will have 2 or 3 thousandths of an inch that it's not flat, it's a bit hollow. But then, that works really well for those frets, because it allows you to lower that point close enough to the fretboard where it's very comfortable to play, but you will get fret buzz here. And the way that we solve that is by basically filing these frets, again, a couple of thousandths of an inch, the thickness of a single piece of masking tape. And that will be the taper that we do from the 12th fret back down to the end of the neck, like this part here. That gets angled down a tiny, tiny bit. So resulting is that your actual neck, completely exaggerated, is a tiny bit S-shaped. And doing that allows us to have the strings super close to the first fret, super comfortable to play. And then we can lower this point as much as we can and bring the strings closest to your neck. And that gives you a perfectly playable guitar. But that requires a lot of precision when you're filing down the frets after you manufactured your first neck. And then there's intonation. Strings vibrate at their intonation point. And if it's very thin string, if this is the nut, like the part of the guitar that sits here, and the string is wedged in between there, it'll vibrate very close to the point where it comes out of the nut. If it's a much thicker piece of metal, you've held a thick steel cable, it doesn't bend that easily, the real vibration point will be a little bit further. That means that when we have those positions of those frets, the vibration points don't really match 100%. That means that in order to correct that across the neck, we're going to move the back saddles in the bridge, these, we're going to move those a little bit forward or a little bit back. And that allows us to get a semi-okay intonation across a guitar's neck. Semi-okay meaning we're going to be very close to the actual notes, but not spot on, because it's always a compromise. You can intonate a neck to be playable and perfectly in tune at certain positions, but it's never going to be perfectly in tune across the whole neck. Right? And that's your compromise when you're setting up a guitar. You can move these forward and backwards, but it's still going to be a compromise. Theoretically impossible. And then some nerds went, hold my beer. Because we do two things, and two things that cause the intonation to go off. First is this. The other is the tension. If you press down a string, you're actually increasing the tension, which also throws your note off a tiny bit. So the first thing gets solved by something called an Evertune bridge. An Evertune bridge is a thing that we hide inside the guitar's body and that has springs in it to keep a string at perfect tension even if you press it down. Pretty cool. It gets rid of that effect of when I press down my string a little bit harder or a little bit less hard, it going out of tune. It also makes string bending a little bit harder, but I mean, it solves a particular problem. But then we still have the problem with the vibration points. And then, of course, we can apply science to that. And if you let a bunch of nerds do that, then they come up with something they call a true temperament neck. A true temperament neck looks like this. And that neck is in tune across the entire neck. There is no way that you can ever manufacture one of those fretboards in your own workshop. It's impossible to work on. You cannot pull those frets out and reinstall them. So you either buy the fretboard or you buy the entire neck. But it does work. It's a horror to work on, because every time this breaks, you basically have to throw it out and get a new neck. But it does work. I mean, nerds can be nerds, right? And then if we have to pick up all the stuff that's happening on the neck, and we've set up our compromise, because let's be real here, I'm probably not going to be doing anything like that soon. But I've made my neck, and I've made an intonation compromise. We have to transform what is happening with the strings into electrical pulses, right? We have to get it to an amplifier so that you can hear what I'm playing, right? And for that, we have pickups, and they do exactly that. They pick up the string vibration and transform it into electricity. And it's very simple. We have magnets and a coil of copper wire around it, and if something metal vibrates above the magnet, it makes sure that we get inductive currents in the coil, very, very weak inductive currents, but that we can then send over a cable to an amplifier where we can make sure that people hear this. Now, the basic design for the first pickups was just this. We have magnets with a coil around it and that. The problem with this is this also picks up all the other electromagnetic vibrations that are happening around it, which is not always what you want. You want to pick up the string, but not the rest around it. And we can solve that by having something called a humbucker, where we make two coils in opposing directions, and the environmental noises get canceled out, but your string vibration comes through. And that's what we see in a lot of guitars, and it solves that problem. There's different types of constructions. You can have the magnets in the pole pieces or underneath. It doesn't really matter. You will always get a signal, but the construction of these pickups will definitely change the sound of your guitar quite a bit. So whatever you choose there is going to give you a certain timbre. There's pickups that are better for heavy overdriven sounds or for clean sounds, all that sort of stuff. And then we have to wire that together. And as I already told you, that was the stuff that I was comfortable with when I started. Because it's not really, while this looks complex, it's not really. Because what we have is we have the wires that are coming out of the pickups that have weak signals in them. And then we're going to combine the bobbins in certain ways. And then we will apply a variable resistor, basically a single pot meter. And that is by putting that between the positive and the negative, we will control the volume. And if we then put a capacitor between that with another pot meter, we will control the tone, because we're basically rolling away the high tones. The capacitor will filter those out, and then the low tones still get through, and we get a different sound to our guitar. And there's many different ways to combine like the stuff that happens here, but that's the essence. That's what we're doing when we're wiring guitars. And there's crazy stuff like switching them in reverse polarity and all that sort of stuff. It all comes down to the same thing. A coil with some magnets and some pot meters to control the output. So this is what the wiring on that first guitar looked like. And that's the cool thing about the Jazzmaster. It has two different tone circuits. So you can flip that guitar between the top tone circuit, which is the rhythm circuit, and then you have the normal one, the lead circuit. And you get completely different sounds. It's a pain in the ass. And I chose violence on myself again, because I chose to use vintage cloth-covered wires, which is very annoying to work with, and this doesn't give you anything over a plastic-covered wire, except for aesthetics. Right.
Nobody ever sees.
Nobody ever sees. It's inside the guitar. Like, only I know, right? That's the thing. And there's so many myths, and that's the stuff that I had to kind of figure out by myself. In the guitar building world, there are so many myths that have persisted for such a long time. Stuff that people believe to be true, but that has now since been dispelled. But still, people believe this quite a lot. The first is tone wood. Now, I'm not talking about acoustic guitars. The type of wood that you use for an acoustic guitar is definitely going to change the sound of it. On an electric guitar like this, that is basically the only responsibility that wood has, is to make sure that your neck doesn't flip away with the tension and to attach the bridge to it, right? That's what that wood does. It doesn't really change the tone. People still believe it does. But during COVID, and this is one of the things that we can love COVID for, this dude, Anderson, he decided, I'm going to test this myth. And he started with a normal guitar. And he played it, and he recorded the sound, and then he started comparing it with other guitars. So this is another neck, where it was a very cheap AliExpress neck that he used. He made sure that a couple of factors stayed constant. The scale length, the length from the nut to the bridge, the height of the pickup and the position of the pickup, right? And the string gauge of the strings. And he made sure that those factors remained constant. So we switched to a cheaper neck and cheaper guitar, and then he replaced the body with a 2x4. And then he ended up with this. Removing the wood out of the equation altogether. All of these sounded exactly the same, right? There's no way that you can hear the difference. So that has completely been dispelled. So what actually does affect the sound quite a bit? The type of pickup that you're using and where you're positioning it and how high it sits, that's actually going to change most of your sound. So if you take a guitar and you swap out the pickups, you can change a lot of the sound by just doing that. The length of your strings is something you can't really change. When you have to buy a different guitar for that. Because even buying a different neck, then your bridge is in the wrong position, it doesn't work. So the scale length definitely does matter. If you have a little bit longer or a bit shorter strings, the vibrations are different. The thickness of the strings that you play, that definitely has an effect as well. And then to a very, very minor effect, the materials that are used in the nut and the bridge, because that will either give you a little bit more sustain or a bit less sustain. It doesn't drastically change the sound anymore. Anything else is probably not going to be measurable. But we believe it does, because we're guitar nerds, so yeah. Also, a very nice myth is that the construction, how the neck and the body are attached, matters for how long the string can vibrate. Sustain is you pluck a string and it keeps vibrating for a shorter or a longer time. And it was long believed that the type of construction, either it being screwed on or glued on or made from a single piece of wood, that drastically affected how long the string could vibrate. Now, we have also learned now that most of that myth comes from a lot of cheaper guitars are built with this construction. And this is stuff that you can only find on more expensive guitars. So that proliferates the myth. But what actually happens also if the fit here between the two pieces of wood is really bad and it's screwed together very poorly, then that does affect sustain. But if you do this properly, it works just as well as having a single piece of wood. Yet we guitar nerds believe that it doesn't. Also, survivor bias. Definitely a thing. Older guitars are better, right? The old designs are better. The old guitars are better. Not really, though. I mean, the ones that survived from a long time ago, they were the ones that were worth keeping, so they're obviously going to be good instruments. But a Gibson has so many flaws in its design. Like, Gibsonitis is a thing that we use in the guitar builder world. If you drop the guitar, it just snaps off there. Construction is horrible. Fender, on the other hand, didn't make the most ergonomic guitars, but the construction was really made from an engineering point of view to use as little wood as possible to make them cheap to produce. Also, because the direction of the wood grain and the direction of the headstock is straight, it doesn't snap off. You can drop a Fender all day long. You will never snap it off here unless you really try, right? But that doesn't yield the most beautiful or most ergonomic guitars. So that brings me to, like, is there any innovation happening in the space? People that are doing cooler things? Yes, definitely. There's people that are building fantastic guitars. So for instance, Yamaha experimented with, what if we take away most of the wood? Do we still have something that's playable? And they made the silent guitars. So you don't have a body that resonates, but you put an electric pickup in it, and you can play this just as well. And that's why I brought the red one. I almost never take this to conferences, because I promised my wife I wouldn't take it out of the house. Yeah, that went wrong. I've wanted that guitar.
Bring it down.
Yeah, she knows it's here. She has made peace with it. I have wanted that guitar ever since I was a teenager in the 90s. I saw it in the magazines, and it was all the innovation in just one piece of guitar. If I have time, I'll geek out over it at the end of the talk. It had so much innovation into it, and I've only acquired it like half a year ago. And I have written this talk longer ago. So this slide was in there before I got that guitar. And this is probably the only conference ever where they're both going to be in the same place. So I had to bring it here, right? But they did so many crazy things. That's like, there's carbon fiber in there, and there's very weird things going on with the electronics. The bridge system is magnificent. It's basically an indestructible piece of kit. Very nice. Strandberg is one of those brands that have thought about ergonomics quite a bit. The shape of this body looks really weird, but it's super comfortable if it sits on your lap. It's also very light. It also hangs on your neck really nicely when you play it. What you can see here is they have fanned the frets. They're not all parallel to each other, which makes it put less strain on your wrist when you play it. It's more natural. It takes a bit of getting used to, but they're doing cool things. One of my favorite guitar builders in Belgium, Tao Guitars, they color outside the lines very, very hard. And they build these beautiful works of art that are nothing like the old guitars. Still very, very nice pieces. I've played one once and it was fantastic. And then there's people doing really crazy shit. This is called the Birdfish. The only thing that annoys me about this guitar builder, Teufel, is they bought into the whole tone wood myth. Because you can get these two pieces of wood and they're swappable. You can screw them off and get different ones for it. And he claimed that the guitar would sound different. While there is a piece of aluminum running, yeah. But at least it's cool. It's cool looking, wouldn't you agree? And it's also super comfortable to play. The last thing I want to touch when I'm building guitars, and then we're really going to dive into the one that I've built. When we write code, going back on something you've done is super easy. You rebase your branch, you roll back commits, it's super easy to do. It's something we do every day, right? It didn't work what I just did, I'm going back. Well, when you're working with wood, if you take away a piece of wood that wasn't supposed to be gone, you have a problem. You need to fix this and it's gonna take very long. And there are so many mistakes that I made on this guitar, and I make it a point to fail in the open, so I'm gonna talk about all of them. So this is glued together, and when I was routing out the piece that needed to be gone for this to be glued together, my router slipped, and that's what you see there. There was a tiny bit of piece of wood that was gone that, well, was not supposed to be gone. So I had to grain match a tiny piece of wood so that the wood grain would go in the same direction. I had to shape it exactly so that it nicely lined up. Had to glue it in there and then reroute the pocket. And then cost me probably an entire evening for a 2-second mistake. And that's exactly the opposite when we're coding. You can fuck up for 4 hours and then you roll back your commits in 2 seconds, right? Also, there is a bit of glue residue that I didn't clean up properly, and when I applied oil to this guitar, it shows up as a light spot down there. And well, after that, I had already sanded and applied finish and so on, so it was really hard to get that fixed unless I would sand the entire guitar again, so I figured like I'm gonna leave it in. Also, not really a mistake you can now still see, but I can explain to you what went wrong. The thickness of this guitar, I kept it as thin as I possibly could because I need to travel with it, and the thinner I make it, the lighter it gets. It's 32 millimeters thick, remember that number. 32 millimeters thick, and I was first planning on using a super switch. A super switch is a magical 5-position switch with a lot of contact points that you can do complex wiring with. Now, if you can see, like from the plate that sits inside the body to the bottom of the contact is 34 millimeters. So I had that switch, and I was like, yeah, that's not gonna fit. So now I have 2 small switches here to solve the problem and give me the things that I wanted. But yeah, it was supposed to have one of those. And then this is my brand name, inspired after the village on the street where I live. That is my wood burning stamp. And wood burning, like if you apply this label, it's kind of hard to do because you have to remember how long you're going to press it down. So you do a couple of test pieces on the cutoffs of this wood, and you heat up the stamp and you try until you get like the right amount of burning, and then you time that and you make sure, okay, 17 seconds is what I need to press down. And then you make with a metal piece, you make sure that it aligns properly so that when you put it down, it goes to the right place, right? So I did all that. I clamped something metal to it, I did the 17 seconds, and I lifted it up. And the one thing I hadn't accounted for, it was upside down. So it was upside down, which means that if you look at this guitar from an angle now, this part of the body like curves off just a tiny bit because I had to sand it all away and redo it. And you don't really notice if I don't tell you, but hey, we're talking about failing in the open, right? So that kind of brings me to the end of all of this. So what's my plan with all of this? First of all, when it comes to writing code, I'm probably going to keep doing that. So I'm going to keep building things, and I'm going to keep learning from all the mistakes that I make. and I'm gonna keep sharing my experience with people on stage. And when it comes to guitars building, I'm gonna keep building, and I'm gonna keep learning from my mistakes. I'm gonna make more guitars, and I'm gonna keep sharing my experience. I haven't streamed in a while. It could be a retirement plan, but there's no money in guitars. Not like software development money, right? You can maybe scrape by half of a living building guitars if you try really hard. But I do stream on Twitch when I build. It's been a while since I've streamed because I've had like a crap year, but I vow to pick it up again this year. My setup in my garage, because, well, nerds gonna be nerds. I have an Atom Mini Pro that is also a wireless microphone setup when I'm streaming. There are cameras in the garage that I can use to film the stuff that I'm building, so hopefully this video speeds up a tiny bit. So there's one GoPro above the workbench that I can move side to side and tilt around. And there's another one that takes an overview shot of the entire garage. And then there's a camera that I have on a tripod that I can move to the piece that I'm working with. That laptop is there so that I can hear what people are saying on Discord, and I can talk back on stream. So it's really fun if friends are joining in to look at what I'm building. You can follow every step, and I try to give you a little bit of a narrative if I have the energy to do it. For me, it's a way to fail in the open, and I've talked about that a couple of times, and I think it's one of the most fun ways of learning stuff. And that's how I can see what I'm doing in the shop. So that brings me to the end. What am I going to do with this guitar? I'm going to keep bringing this to conferences. Normally, I don't bring two guitars. It wasn't the privilege that I was coming here by car, so that means bringing more clothes, bringing more guitars. And that's why the Parker is here as well. But I'm going to keep bringing this places. We're going to keep making music. It's always fun to do. I hope to see all of you later tonight. We're going to start playing at 8:40, but we might start early, so be there 8:20, right? This is so much fun. I hope to see you all there. Thank you so much for letting me geek out for an hour, because this has been fun. How much time do we have left?
10.
Okay, 8 minutes. Okay, you want me to tell you what's going on with the red guitar? Yes? Okay, cool. So this is me. But why is this guitar cool? Okay, Ken Parker was a guitar building genius. And he was so far ahead of his time. And last week, when we were rehearsing with Line Breakers, we realized that this was both the most technologically advanced guitar in the room. It was also the only vintage guitar in the room at over 30 years old. Because this guitar was built in 1994. Yeah, I keep telling myself that too. 5 years ago. So this is a vintage guitar, but like this is wood, but it's super thin. Look at it. Like pieces of the body are only this thick because he sculpted it really nice to fit around your tummy, right? He reinforced the back with carbon fiber. So underneath this paint, there is carbon fiber, both the entire back of the body and the entire neck. The neck, the front as well. The fretboard is not made of wood. The fretboard in this case is made of carbon fiber. And remember that I tell you that we usually hammer in the frets? On this guitar, not so much, because that would mean you would cut up the carbon fiber. So these are stainless frets that are bonded on with a special adhesive. But he chose a type of stainless steel that doesn't really wear out. So you can play this guitar for a couple of decades and the frets will not wear out. Also, the neck, because of all the carbon fiber, is so rigid that while there is a truss rod in here, you actually don't use it. Never. It's unnecessary. This neck doesn't move with humidity. It doesn't move with time. It's so fucking hard that it just doesn't bend. The only off-the-shelf component that Ken Parker used to build this was the tuning machines. Everything else was custom designed for this guitar, including, like, while these look like normal pickups, normally you have some screws next to them to adjust the height of the pickups, but he didn't like the look of that. So these actually have screws that go through them. Some of these pole pieces you can stick a hex wrench into to adjust the height of the pickup so that you don't have the ugly screws sitting next to it, right? There's two magnetic pickups that are switched by this switch. But you see another switch here, and that other switch is basically for the piezo elements that are sitting in the bridge, which gives you more of an acoustic guitar sound. And you can either have the acoustic sound or the magnetic sound or both when you use this switch. But that isn't all. If you disengage the switch that is sitting here, it actually, instead of, it bypasses this switch, but it sends the magnetic signal to your left channel and the piezo element to your right channel, and you can use a stereo cable, and you can actually send those two signals to two separate amps if you would so please, right? And then there's this really weird wheel sitting here, and that is to adjust the tension on the floating tremolo. Normally, when you stick in a tremolo arm, yeah, this guitar came with all of the original accessories. So if you stick the tremolo arm in, what you can do is you can basically change the tension on the strings a little bit and create those vibration sounds, right? And normally, if you have a floating tremolo, it means that the point where it sits is dictated by the tension on the strings, counteracted by the tension of a spring. And those two, if they're equal, it sits at a certain spot. The problem with that being, if you break a string, all of your other strings are out of tune because the tension on them changes. Now, what Ken Parker did with this is there is a blade spring that sits in here. With this wheel, you can adjust that balance point. And on the back of the guitar, there is a slide switch. And that switches this tremolo into a floating mode and a downbend only mode. And the thing is, the spring can't pull the bridge back past the point where it disengages. And what you do with this wheel is you set your balance point to be the exact same point where the switch engages. So what you can do is if you break a string on stage, you just flip the switch, your 5 other strings are in tune, you can still do down bends, you can't do up bends anymore, but that's like a trade-off and a best case scenario. What else is weird about this? How much it cost?
Before you answer that, it's on the internet.
It's on the internet. These were... These... Oh, my missus knows what I paid for this. These were... These were $2,500 guitars in the 90s. With inflation, that would equate to probably a 6,000 to 7,000 euro guitar now. Like the amount of innovation that went into that totally warrants that price. If somebody were to build this today, that price would be totally fine. They have gone up in price, but not as much as inflation. So today you can get a better deal on these than 6,000 or 7,000 euros, right? I found one that's in complete working condition. Don't buy these sight unseen. The electronics sometimes break, so make sure that you have one that works completely. So I found one in the Netherlands. I drove down, I talked to the dude. He was the first owner. I still have the original bill in the case, original manual, everything. This is a treasure for me. It was a dream come true. I promised to never take it out of the house, and then Dylan, and it's good that he left the room, he told me a ship in harbor is never safe, but that's not what ships are built for. So 3 weeks after I got this, I took it to Oslo to record video clips with the line breakers. 3 weeks. 3 weeks.
That's not even willpower.
And now it's here in London with me, and it's probably the only conference where this guitar is going to be on stage for this talk, so I'm so happy that I was able to share that with all of you. I think we're out of time. So thank you so much. I'm going to run out to set up and plug in a lot of cables, because we play wireless now, which means that you need more cables. It's true. All of you musicians out there know this, right? Because you have a cable that goes from the instrument to the wireless thing, and then from the wireless thing into the mixer. And then for the monitors that you have in your ears, you have the cable that goes from the mixer into the in-ear setup, and then from... Yeah, so many cables, but it's wireless. Thank you so much. If you have questions, come and hit me up, like at any point at the conference. I'll be here tomorrow. I love to geek out over any of this shit.